I do think there is a radicalization element to some of these spaces. And Bryan Johnson is almost a perfect example of this. You look at Bryan Johnson's web pages and he talks about actually ignore all of the supplements, ignore all of the interventions. The most important thing you can do is get a good night's sleep. That sounds very reasonable and very sensible, and lots of people might be their entry point. I'm just following Bryan Johnson because he thinks sleep's the most important thing, and I'm starting to, I'm struggling with being tired all the time, so I'm going to try following one of his protocols to, and he calls them protocols, which definitely makes it sound very medicinal and medical and evidence based. I'm going to follow his protocols, try and sleep better and enhance my sleep. And then the other things get smuggled in. It's okay, well, if you really want to sleep better, you need to buy this supplement that we sell at the Blueprint Project. And actually, if you really want to sleep, you also need to make sure that you're exercising in the right way, because that will tire you out. But if you want to exercise in the right way, you need this additional supplement to help your muscles. And suddenly you're being drip fed the next step and the next step and the next step. And it does become quite radicalizing.
Welcome to the Wellness Report. My name is Susan Owens. Today we are going to be talking about biohacking. This is all the links that people go to elongate their life, from the everyday routines to the absolute extreme. Joining us is Dr. Alice Howarth. She works in open advocacy research for the University of Sheffield, and she works for the Merseyside Skeptics Society. I just want to start off with this word biohacking. I feel like it's become a bit of a buzzword, and it's actually almost quite simple, but do you want to just kind of run me through what it actually means?
Yeah, so it is quite simple, but it's also its simplicity is almost one of its dangers to some extent, because it's such a broad term. So biohacking can be used to kind of denote anything that is looking at kind of optimizing your health. A lot of people use biohacking to mean specifically longevity. So there's a lot of kind of people looking to prevent their aging and to live as long as reasonably possible. But it can be about just managing your health more broadly. And it can encompass a whole range of different things. So it can be as simple as kind of how much sleep you get at night, all the way up to injecting potentially unregulated and experimental peptides or other treatments.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess in many ways, we all kind of have almost accidentally become biohackers without realizing it. Is it kind of almost just another way of saying like wellness or self-care?
It can be. I think it can definitely be used in that direction, and it because it's such a broad term, it can be used in lots of different ways, and people can be talking cross purposes when they're having conversations about these sorts of topics. So they can be thinking about yeah, absolutely. Self-care, trying to just generally live a happier, healthier life. But they can also be thinking about some of the more extreme forms of biohacking, where they're thinking about really extreme peptide injections or various other things.
What is kind of the science behind the peptide injections?
Yeah, so we have peptide injections that are completely regulated and are reasonable, genuine treatments. Things like insulin is a peptide. Insulin
Right.
is a short version of a protein, and a peptide is simply a few amino acids. It's the beginning steps of building a protein. And so we do have therapeutic peptides like insulin, like GLP-1 agonists are peptide, therapeutic peptides. But then we have these unregulated or experimental peptides that some of the biohacker influencers are promoting, where they're often looking at peptides that have been developed for research purposes. So they're not clinically approved, they're not clinically safe. They're not, because they're designed for research, they're not designed to ever go anywhere near a human body, and so they're not necessarily the right levels of clinical safety and cleanliness that we need for injections, and they haven't been trialed and tested in human patients. So there's a whole breadth of things to think about when it comes to peptides, and it's very difficult to know whether you're taking something safe or something risky.
So how are people getting their hands on these kind of unregulated peptides that are like potentially damaging?
All sorts of ways, and that there are all sorts of different online companies that people are purchasing things like that from, and it will vary from country to country as well. So in the States, things can be a little bit easier to get hold of. in the UK, you kind of, if you're shipping things in from other countries and purchasing online, then it is a bit of an unregulated ecosystem in some ways.
With, I guess, even the need for people to think that they need to do this, like I think it's kind of always being disguised as people being health conscious, but has it actually just become more of like a health anxiety that people have, that they're going to such lengths to the point where, like, I mean, I'm not sure about everyone, but like I feel like growing up, like the thought of injecting yourself with something, like it was genuinely only something I knew that people that had diabetes would ever even think of doing. So is it like an anxiety point that we get to, or is it just full like indoctrination from the wellness world or the social media industry?
I think it's definitely a bit of both in some respects. So I think we definitely are in a cultural moment where health anxiety is really significant, and some of that comes from a positive place. Some of that comes from people wanting to take control and have some sense of autonomy over what they are feeling and what they are experiencing, and they are perhaps experiencing symptoms or side effects of different difficulties that they're going through. I think quite a lot about people who are overworking, who are over optimizing their workspace and becoming burnt out and having symptoms of exhaustion and generally struggling in lots of different ways. And they're looking for ways to feel better and starting to come across people who are suggesting ways that you can optimize and enhance your health at home. But then I think it does start to get really quickly into that health anxiety, and that you're constantly watching for any hint of or niggle of a symptom that might mean something more serious. And suddenly that optimization becomes an obsession, and you're obsessively checking the metrics from your smartwatch or
Yes.
all of the different things that are telling you that you're on the way to feeling unwell. How can we try and regulate that?
Do you think a lot of this has kind of started with the smartwatch and being able to track your metrics? Because I know I wear one, and I do think there are mornings I wake up where I feel awful, and then I'll get the little notification that says, "Oh, that's a very high sleep score. You went to bed on time."
Yes.
So I just know that it's not all true or anything. So do you think that's where it started? Because I feel like it went from the smartwatch to the ring that you can wear now,
Yeah.
and then at one point there was people who wore I don't know the name of it, but the
Heart rate
injection
monitors.
point. Yeah, the heart rate monitor and the injection
The
point on
continuous
your arm.
glucose,
Yeah, the
continual
glucose
glucose
trackers.
monitors. Yeah, and we can
Yes.
talk about those because they're very interesting. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think wearables have a lot to answer for, because I think wearables have definitely contributed to that health anxiety and this kind of quick, as you say, this quick proliferation of various different devices and different ways that we can monitor things. But I think they come in a context where people were already starting to feel like they were experiencing something that they wanted to track. So I think we already had a lot of pressure to optimize in the wider cultural context and social context. People were often trying to think about how to work as many hours as possible, and to really,
Mm.
we've got the side hustle phrase of trying to hustle and make as much money as possible and optimize all of the different ways in which that you can be the most productive member of society more broadly. And I think it's very interesting then that biohacking has been around for decades, but it comes out of the tech industry. It comes out of that hacker ethos. And you get those kind of tech people who are looking to hustle and to optimize and to enhance in the workplace, in the money making space, in the how do we become entrepreneurs and make a fortune. And then that transitions into, well, how do I do that? Maybe I optimize my sleep so that I can work longer hours, so that I can be more healthy and not need to take time off work and all of those things. And it all feeds in. And okay, that might be a niche group of people in the first instance, but it starts to permeate into wider society, that you need to be a productive member of society. And it's all inside the contexts of how we think about welfare, how we think about disabled people in our society. And suddenly there's all of this need a feeling of a need to be a productive member of society and to be contributing. And then come the devices, and you can track your sleep, and you can try and enhance and optimize your ability to be productive and your ability to engage with the world as reliably as possible and live as long as possible.
Yeah, do you feel like the tech industry, it's almost like we've advanced so much in life that they're just trying to essentially make it that we can live forever? I mean, you do see these biohackers, and that is a lot of their goal is like longevity and living forever and all this kind of stuff. But like, is doing things like continuously tracking your glucose on it, like, what is the, I guess, the highs and lows of that? Like, what's the pros and cons of knowing this
Yeah.
much information about yourself?
And I think this is the big issue. So, if we take a step back to wearables, a lot of the wearables that we can actually wear day to day are not sensitive enough
Mm-hmm.
for what people are using them for. We have very sensitive medical wearable devices that will revolutionize diagnostics and healthcare, that you can get very, very sensitive heart rate monitors, but they are still incredibly expensive. The ones that you're buying and wearing day to day are a lot less sensitive. They're a lot more likely to make mistakes. And that's where you get the experience of, I feel really tired, but my monitor tells me I slept really well.
Yes.
And vice versa, you will get your monitor telling you had a really bad night's sleep and think, well, I feel fine. But now suddenly that's playing on your mind, and maybe I am tireder than I thought I would, and than I thought I was. And that's starting to really filter into how you're perceiving your own feelings. And then you get into things like continuous glucose monitors, which are absolutely revolutionary for people with diabetes. They are constantly tracking your glucose. You don't have to do the regular blood sugar checks that people, used to have to do, and some people still do. That's still how some people kind of monitor their condition. But the continuous glucose monitor is doing a constant check, so you know when to take your medication, when to take your insulin. And you're starting to see people using them just for general day-to-day life. And the perspective is, and the claims that are being made are that in order to enhance your metabolism and to enhance your digestion, you need to reduce your glucose spikes. So what people are doing is using the continuous glucose monitors to see when their glucose is spiking and trying to change their diet to reduce those spikes. Now, a glucose spike is a normal part of digestion. You eat a meal, your glucose increases in your blood, and your body does everything it needs to do to break down that energy. So the spike is absolutely required, especially if you are, you're insulin sensitive, you don't have diabetes, you don't have any health condition. That encourages your insulin to be produced and all of your metabolism to kick in and break down the meal that you've eaten. It's a completely normal part of digestion. And yet people are trying to avoid that and are analyzing every meal that they eat in order to avoid that. And suddenly that optimization has gone from how well you slept and how many steps you took, and into every single thing that you do throughout the day. Every time you eat, every snack you have, every time you feel a bit hungry, you're thinking about, how do I optimize these things? And I think psychologically that can be incredibly damaging, because it's constant obsession with numbers and tracking and regulating what you're doing.
I guess it's almost like turning yourself into like a science experiment, but you have absolutely zero qualifications to conduct that experiment. I mean, if you don't consult a doctor as the bare minimum to get all of these things checked, I think like seeing a social media advertisement which wants you to constantly monitor your whole body and everything like that is just basically taking out the need for medical professionals that will actually save your life down the line when you've done the wrong thing. And like I've talked to a few people about like how we're all almost like self-medicating by just deciding like, oh, I'll take these gummies, or I'll take these supplements, and that will help me feel better. But it's, you haven't even had the test to see if you're deficient in anything. And like I've done it in the past just by being like, oh well, I'm sure that's fine, or it's in a gummy format, so it must not be that bad. And like I've been completely fine from doing that, but I've also been wasting money doing
Yeah.
that, and time, and it just almost like the very basics of life, of like, you are not feeling well, so you go to the doctor. And I know in other countries it's not as simple to do that, but when you look at the UK and why aren't people utilizing the NHS to get blood tests to see what they're deficient, to see what will actually help them? Like, what is that kind of gap between what we can do now, which is just go to the GP and ask?
Yeah. And I think there really is a gap. And I think some of this is symptomatic of that wider context that some people, particularly people with things like chronic illnesses, are sometimes struggling to get the support that they need from the medical world. They maybe feel dismissed by their doctors because of internalized bias that is just not, that medical bias exists and it is real. And for people, particularly women, particularly people of color, particularly disabled people, it can be challenging to get a medical diagnosis when you are struggling with particular symptoms, especially if those symptoms are things like fatigue or kind of aches and pains, and they're not really measurable, easy to identify things. So I do think there is a gap there. And I do think that some of the wellness space is jumping into that gap. That doesn't mean it's a reasonable solution. Actually, I think what we need to do is be starting to unpick some of this medical bias and trying to empower patients to get that second opinion and to advocate for themselves, to get the support that they actually need, rather than turning to unregulated wellness spaces. But I think it's a real issue, especially with things like direct-to-consumer testing kits and things like that. People are pathologizing, and often pathologizing even normal experiences. They are tired at the end of the day, and suddenly there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my, I've got adrenal fatigue or various other conditions that aren't really based in any evidence because of a very normal experience. And that's becoming very normalized, that people are looking for a way to cure something that is just normal.
It's now the time where we talk about the extreme measures of this. This is so Bryan Johnson basically is like the biggest example of someone I think like widely known. He makes headlines constantly. He pays $2 million a year to have these data-driven anti-aging protocols that he calls Project Blueprint, which naturally has kind of turned into a business model where people can now subscribe and get involved as well. But his main purpose of that is to reduce the biological age of his organs to 18 years old, to kind of make death almost an option and to ideally live forever somehow. So he's tried very outlandish things, and this is a very, very long list, so bear with me. But it kind of ranges from, having doctors constantly monitor him around the clock, blood plasma experiments, including plasma transfusions from his son, and then taking 100 plus supplements a day, routinely measuring and tracking his and his son's erections, storing his girlfriend's menstrual blood to do experiments on. And then the most recent reports that he's claiming, and it's very, very heavy on the word claiming here, is that he's cloned himself by using an embryo so that eventually he can take organs and stem cells from this. And that'll help him with his recently diagnosed autoimmune gastritis. So it's quite a lot to unpack. And we'll get onto the gastritis element of it as well, the illness element. But let's just start with the major difference between like biohacking, which for some people it's get 9 hours of sleep and then jump in an ice bath, to then this, let's do scientific research on my whole family's most intimate body and then we'll all live forever. Is it just the distance there, finance? Like, could we all eventually, if we had all the money in the world, would we all end up like Bryan Johnson? Or is this like such a specific man with too much money kind of case?
I think it's a number of things, and I think one of the things that I think we need to be wary of, and is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially with the media coverage of lux maxers. And I think lux maxing is essentially biohacking. It's they're very similar spaces, but I think because of the real focus on aesthetics there, we can see very rapidly some often young men disappearing into that rabbit hole of body dysmorphia, developing genuine, real medical conditions that affect their ability to perceive themselves and perceive their personal experiences. And I think this is something, and I wouldn't want to speak to any medical diagnosis of any particular individual, so I won't speak to Bryan Johnson directly, but I think there is an issue in some of these communities with people becoming so anxious and obsessed about optimizing that they are developing conditions like orthorexia, which is an eating disorder where you are particularly obsessed with eating clean, healthy foods, or orthosomnia, which is a condition where you are particularly obsessed with enhancing your sleep to the detriment of your sleep, or things like body dysmorphia, where you are having a more extreme enhancements to affect your physical aesthetic appearance. And I think these are becoming potentially incredibly damaging and more prevalent in certain groups because of that obsession. So I don't know that every person would get there if they had the money, because I don't know that every person would have the would follow that same kind of medical trajectory. But I do think there is a radicalization element to some of these spaces. And Bryan Johnson is almost a perfect example of this. You look at Bryan Johnson's web pages and he talks about actually ignore all of the supplements, ignore all of the interventions. The most important thing you can do is get a good night's sleep. That sounds very reasonable and very sensible, and lots of people might be their entry point. I'm just following Bryan Johnson because he thinks sleep's the most important thing, and I'm starting to, I'm struggling with being tired all the time, so I'm going to try following one of his protocols to, and he calls them protocols, which definitely makes it sound very medicinal and medical and evidence based. I'm going to follow his protocol to try and sleep better and enhance my sleep. And then the other things get smuggled in. It's okay, well, if you really want to sleep better, you need to buy this supplement that we sell at the Blueprint Project. And actually, if you really want to sleep, you also need to make sure that you're exercising in the right way, because that will tire you out. But if you want to exercise in the right way, you need this additional supplement to help your muscles. And suddenly you're being drip fed the next step and the next step and the next step. And it does become quite radicalizing. Especially if, well, I tried this and it helped a bit. I saw some effects. It definitely helped a bit, but it didn't cure everything. It didn't make everything better. So now I'm going to try something else. I'm still going to trust this person because it definitely made some difference, but I'm going to try some other things that they recommend. And step by step, you're kind of led down the garden path towards the more extreme things. And some people might have a line and they might reach the point that, okay, I'm done with this now. But other people will continue to be drawn down that radicalization pipeline.
Yeah, and like you said about speculating on someone else's condition, like I wouldn't want to do that at all. And there are so many reasons why autoimmune conditions can get triggered. And I think there's a lot of media that are kind of speculating, saying, oh, well, nothing he did worked then, like he's now failed at this whole thing of longevity. And it's kind of one of those things, is that like we'll never know, because if he does live forever, we won't be the people who know about that because we won't live forever. And it's one of these things of like, it just seems it must be so all consuming for someone to be so focused and dedicating so much time to this idea of living forever, that they're kind of missing the whole aspect where you actually get to live your life along the way. And I think like that's the bit that scares me the most, is when you see, and it does happen, I think I kind of see it a lot more. I mean, we know about the body image issues that women go through, and it's so publicized, but I feel like I see it more now with young guys that are growing up in the world, and young men going through and not having the same kind of avenue to talk about these issues that women have. And it just kind of, I don't know, it kind of takes that element out of life and enjoying life. And it's like, of course we all have to take care of ourselves and our bodies and stuff, but when you see someone who wants to live forever to the point where they've replaced the sun with red light therapy, and it's just this thing of having to like think about yourself so much that you just kind of get lost along the way. And it's kind of just how damaging that stuff like this, like how I guess, I don't know, I don't want to just focus on just him, but just he's kind of the best example for it, but like how damaging this kind of work can be on people. And what does this kind of look like, or what does the future look like? Are we all going to eventually end up in these pathways, or will this kind of just be another fad diet that just is on
Yeah.
a large scale, do you think?
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's really, really sad. And actually, one of the things Bryan Johnson specifically says is I read an interview with him from earlier this year where he specifically said he has this don't die ethos. It's not living forever. It's not dying. It's being in the moment and not dying now. It's not about having a happy, fulfilled, enjoyable life and living that life. It is about putting everything into just not dying. And that must be utterly exhausting
Yeah.
for that to be what you're thinking about every minute of every day, to the detriment of actually enjoying your life. And I think absolutely young men are being funneled in this particular direction. I think there are issues with young men struggling with particularly not having an outlet to deal with the loneliness that they might experience or the different difficulties that they're experiencing, and they're turning to podcasters and social media influencers and looks maxers and biohackers who will claim that they've got the answers, and then they're very rapidly going into the AI tunnel to develop their own protocols and plans of how they're going to manage their own lives. And now all they're doing is having conversations with other people inside their communities, the Luxmaxer communities or the biohacker communities, or whichever group that they ascribe to, and AI chatbots to develop the most optimized version of their day-to-day life. And it is completely all consuming. And how do you then break out of that cycle and engage with the real world and with real people and start to build a healthy outlook on your life? I think it is very challenging. I'm a bit more optimistic. I hope that with some targeted thinking around these topics, and the more we know about these topics, and it's exactly why I spend a lot of time investigating these sorts of topics, is because actually I think we need to understand what is the basis for those positions. So, it's very easy to say this is just about health and wellness. What's at the base of it? What draws people into those particular areas? And it is different for different groups of people. It's different in different lenses of wellness. As you've rightly pointed out, there's women's wellness and there's this kind of hyper masculinized version of wellness. They're very different things that appeal to people in very different ways. But how do we understand what draws people to that so that we can start to think about ways to unpick it and support people in different ways on their level, not making any assumptions about who they are as individuals, but actually engaging with them as people? Because I think that's what biohacking offers to people. It's personal, individualized autonomy to do something for yourself. You're only going to be able to counter that if you talk to people on that level, on that giving people the autonomy to make their own decisions, which is the basis of healthcare, right? Informed consent and making your own decisions is the basis of what we do and talk about when we talk about healthcare. Let's start to actually practice that and engage with people and meet people where they're at, and have these conversations without dismissing or demonizing people, and actually listening to what's encouraging them to go down those pathways.
Absolutely. And the work that you do you want to explain that as well, just so people know that like there are sources that you can go to kind of get more information about everything that you're being fed in the world?
Yeah, so I'm part of an organisation called the Merseyside Skeptic Society, and we do an awful lot of different things. So I do a podcast called Skeptics with a K, where we investigate these sorts of topics and themes from this lens of understanding why people might be drawn in, but also where the evidence is and what we can do to understand that evidence more reasonably, and how we can have these sorts of conversations. We also have a magazine called The Skeptic Magazine, where we again pick up some of these topics. We have writers from all sorts of different areas of expertise talking about wellness, but also about conspiracism and radicalization, all sorts of different areas in this space. And then we run events in the UK, some in Merseyside in our local area, where we have built this kind of community that allows people to engage with each other on these sorts of topics. But we also run kind of larger events. And I also work together with a group called the Skeptics in the Pub Online, who host online talks. And we have a Discord channel so people can come and chat to us about things as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that is all from us today at The Wellness Report. Please subscribe for more interviews just like this one.